Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I want to welcome you to another in our series of the Caroline Llewellyn Champlin Writers Talking series. This evening, we have a most distinguished speaker, Peter Lawson Johnston, the author of Growing Up Guggenheim, A Personal History of a Family Enterprise. We are so honored to have him here tonight, and I wanted to thank his daughter, Wendy McNeil, for making that possible. Peter Lawson Johnston has been a trustee of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation since 1964 and is also the grandson of Solomon R. Guggenheim. His positions on the Board of Trustees have included Vice President, Business Administration, President, Chairman, and Honorary Chairman. Mr. Lawson Johnston attended the Lawrenceville School and graduated with honors from the University of Virginia. He is a trustee of the Lawrenceville School and served as president of the Board of Trustees there from 1990 to 1997. He is also the recipient of the Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney Award from the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and the Lawrenceville Medal. He is a most distinguished guest. His book is absolutely fascinating and has the added bonus of some wonderful reproductions of some significant works of art to both Mr. Lawson Johnston and to the Guggenheim. So you will have the opportunity to purchase the book after his talk, and Peter will be signing the books up here afterwards. He will speak for a while and then take questions from the audience, and I think we have a wonderful evening in store for us. So please join me in welcoming Peter Lawson Johnston.
Thank you, Susan, for those generous comments. It's nice of you all to make the pilgrimage here on a night like this, which isn't quite as bad as we all expected. This is my first and last book that we're talking about. Years ago, people asked me, right now, whatever made you decide you could write a book? And it never occurred to me until about 20 years ago. I had attended a function at the Guggenheim. And the head of our development office was in a taxi with me, and I was telling her a story about my grandfather, and she said, "You ought to write a book." And I thought about it, and the first job I had when I got out of the University of Virginia was working on the Baltimore Sun as a newspaper reporter, phoning my stories into Russell Baker. And I one day reported for work, and the editor said, "Lawson Johnston, do you know anything about boats?" And I said, "Not really, sir." He said, "Well, you're a yachting editor." And I had a column called Rounding the Buoy, terribly important. I didn't know anything about yachting either. The book is basically autobiographical, but I'm really focusing on my grandfather, Solomon, Harry Guggenheim, my cousin, and Peggy Guggenheim, another cousin. Both of them were first cousins of my mother, and my mother, Barbara, was Solomon Guggenheim's youngest daughter. The Guggenheim family, you probably heard, came from Switzerland, and my great-grandfather was a peddler, selling stove polish in Pennsylvania. They lived in Philadelphia, and then when things got a little more lucrative, they moved to New York. My great-grandfather and his 7 sons got into the mining business, and almost all of them, having been successful in that, decided to give back to the country for the great things that happened to them because of the country. My grandfather was having his portrait done by a German baroness, Hilla Rebbe, and that seating was arranged by my grandmother. And I've always envisioned that the baroness talked to my grandfather about his success and said that at his age, really, he ought to develop a new interest, Well, the new interest was her interest, which was non-objective art. And my grandfather became very enraptured not only with non-objective art, but with the Baroness. I've always referred to her as his confidante. I think that covers a lot of territory. But she really is the heroine who convinced him that non-objective art made sense, even though it was called non-objective. And as a result of that, you know the rest, the Guggenheim Museum. And my grandfather was a wonderful fellow. I think I was in my early 20s when he died. He lived very well. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was very dignified. But I remember we used to motor back from his plantation in South Carolina to Long Island, and we would stop off somewhere, Richmond or wherever. One time we went to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, and my grandmother and my brother got off, and my grandfather said, you come with me, Peter. And we walked off into an area where there was a little shrubbery. And he said, I want you, he had a sense of history, I want you to be able to tell your grandchildren that you and your grandfather watered George Washington's lawn. Harry Guggenheim became the patriarch of the family after all the 7 brothers died. He was quite a guy. He was ambassador to Cuba under Hoover. He was in the service, World War I and II. He had a lot to do with aviation and was a great friend of Charles Lindbergh. He supported rocketry when Goddard was looking for assistance. He won the Kentucky Derby with Dark Star, beating Vanderbilt's Native Dancer. And, of course, he was the head of the Guggenheim after Hilla, who really wasn't a very good manager, although very knowledgeable about art. He succeeded her. He also, with his wife Alicia Patterson, started the newspaper Newsday out on Long Island. So I was in awe of this man. And when Dee Dee and I moved to Princeton, Dee Dee, by the way, is my wife here, people would say, knowing that my mother was a Guggenheim, what's going on at the Guggenheim? Well, I didn't have the foggiest notion. And I summoned up the courage to go to see Harry, who I really didn't know. He knew of me, but he knew my mother and my brother much better because they were very much in the horse world, which I was not. And I had an appointment with him at 120 Broadway, where we both were in the same building. I was in the mining business. And when I got to meet him, I said, Harry, would it be possible to put me on the mailing list? And he said, I'm sure we can do that. And then he sort of checked me out without my knowledge, as I knew he would. And at that point, I was on the board of Kennecott Copper. I was moving up the ladder in a mining company. I had a wonderful family with coming along, and he very soon made me vice president of business administration and put me on the board as a trustee. So later on, we became closer and closer, and I'll never forget, he had hired Bill Moyers out of the White House to run Newsday and be publisher of it. And Harry was down in Florida, and Dee Dee and I were in bed on a Saturday morning. The phone rang. It was Harry. He said, I want you to come down here. And I always jumped when he said things like that, and I did. And I went down, and I said, what's the problem? He said, well, look at this. And he had a whole stack of Newsday editorials, which were very anti-Nixon. And he said, I'm embarrassed to have my name on the masthead. I mean, there ought to be at least one editorial that has something favorable to say about Nixon. So he said, I want you to sell the paper to my friends at the Los Angeles Times. And Norman Chandler is a reasonably middle-of-the-road kind of a fellow and a friend of mine and thinks the way I do, and I'd like him to own the paper, and it doesn't matter too much how much I get paid for it. And I said, well, why don't you just get rid of Bill Moyers and give him a nice send-off? And he said, no, I'm getting too old, and that's the way I want to do it. So the problem there, and we succeeded in selling it to the Times-Mirror. The only thing that Harry hadn't realized was that Otis Chandler had taken over from his father, and he was more liberal than Bill Moyers. So anyway, as you know, Peggy Guggenheim had a role in all of this. She competed with the Baroness acquiring modern art. They weren't very fond of each other. And Peggy, of course, developed her own collection, had her palazzo in Venice. And we were very anxious to acquire Peggy's collection. And she had talked to some museums in England and was about to do something there at the Tate, I believe. And apparently the authorities wouldn't let her dog into the country. So she got very upset with them and succumbed to our entreaties. We, of course, thought that we would bring the collection to the United States. That was not her idea at all. And the contract said that it would be kept there. And then Peggy wrote a P.S., if Venice sinks, I still want my collection in Venice. I think one of the funny stories about Peggy, and I got to know her quite well, she had been married, among other people, to Max Ernst, the artist. And we had an exhibit of Ernst many years ago at the Guggenheim, and it was a black tie affair, and I remember meeting Mr. Ernst. And Dee Dee and I had just visited her in Venice, and I said, oh, Mr. Ernst, just come from Venice where I stayed with Peggy. He said, Peggy? Peggy who? I think he knew who I meant. I also talk in the book about Tom Messer, who was the director when I was president of the board, and we overlapped for a good many years. And then I have a chapter about him. He was a wonderful man. I'll never forget, there was a sculpture by Brancusi called the Muse, M-U-S-E, and it was owned by Mr. Bulova, another Swiss, or a man that lived in Switzerland, and he died, and he left it to us, and we were delighted to have this. And I remember Tom Messer, whenever it would be on exhibit, he would caress it with his hand. He just thought this was, and it is, a beautiful piece. Well, anyway, when Mr. Brent, after he had died, of course, his widow, who knew Brancusi, said, my husband didn't know anything about Brancusi, and really, he shouldn't have given it to you. So she went to court to retrieve it from us, and succeeded, much to our annoyance. And so anyway, later, many years later, she had sold it to someone, and we bought it back, I think, for $1.2 million. So that was something that pleased Tom Messer so much to get the Muse back. Tom Krenz, you've all heard about. Actually, he was recommended to me by Tom Messer. And I went up to Williams College, which he was the director of Williams College, the museum there. And he took me out to a town nearby, and it was an abandoned factory. And he said, this ought to be a museum, and I began to wonder how sensible this man was. But anyway, forgetting about that, he was an impressive man, and so we took him on. And he's been very controversial, but on balance, I think he's put the Guggenheim on the map. I think I ought to tell you that about Bilbao, because I think he has much to do with the success of that project. And I think you've all probably read that the Guggenheim, were really visionaries, that we came up with this idea. Well, we really didn't. The fact of the matter is that the Basque government approached us, and with the idea of being our partners in building a museum in Bilbao, a city neither one of us had ever heard of, but it is the fourth biggest city in Spain, and it was an industrial city. And so Tom said, Peter, the only thing I know about the Basques is terrorists and jai-alai. And this really doesn't make much sense, but let's not be rude. Why don't we come up with sort of an impossible demand, and then they'll go away and everybody will live happily ever after. So we said, if you'll give us $20 million for our endowment and $100 million to build the museum and $50 million to acquire art to put in it, and guarantee us no operating loss, we'll do it. And within a week they said, okay. So we're visionaries. The truth of the matter is that the Basque government, they were the real visionaries, and they had the courage to tax their people and turn around and spend it in this way. It's hard to imagine anybody in this country in the political world doing such a thing, but I guess it's possible. My role at the Guggenheim was very exciting over the years. At one point, it became obvious that our endowment was inadequate, and Tom Krenz said that what we needed was some people of substantial means on the board. I'd been bringing people on the board who I thought were great people, but they weren't of substantial means, most of them. And Ronald Perlman, whom you've all heard of, was a friend of one of our trustees, and it became very apparent that if I stepped aside as president and he became president of the foundation, that he would give us $20 million, which seemed like a lot of money. And so I stepped aside and became chairman. And a few years later, Frank Gehry, the artist, the architect who was responsible for that fabulous building in Bilbao, said that Peter Lewis was a client of his he was building a house for him in Ohio, and he would be a wonderful trustee. So we did invite Peter to be a member of our board. He came on board. He soon realized that our endowment was inadequate, and he went to Ronald Perlman and he said, Ron, you ought to give $100 million and I'll give 50. Or you give 50 and I'll give 25 million. But, you're the big man here. You're president and I'm just a member of the board. So anyway, Ron's attitude, quite rightly maybe, was that he didn't need any advice about how to spend his money. And he just didn't respond. So Tom came to the conclusion that maybe Peter Lewis would be generous to us. And it became very obvious to me that if he were chairman, maybe he'd be very generous. And sure enough, $50 million was pledged. And I'll never forget the meeting. I said, it was a great honor to step aside for Ron. And now, in the best interests of the foundation, this endeavor we share, I'm happy to step aside as chairman for Peter to assume that title. And I said, there's only one problem here. I'm running out of titles. So they said, you can have any title you want, and that's why I'm honorary chairman. You've probably heard about the Perlman and Peter Lewis. They were inseparable when he became chairman. The two of them pretty much ignored the board, all of us. The two of them were happily doing everything in the world that Tom Krenz wanted to be done. And we've made many arrangements, with in Berlin we have a joint venture. Of course, as you know, we're in Venice, we're in Bilbao, and we're in Las Vegas, and we're looking at other places. Well, over a period of time, Peter Lewis kept making these generous gifts and to the endowment, and then, of course, at the end of every year, we'd have a deficit, and Tom Krenz would say, well, we'll have to take it out of the endowment to make up the deficit. And after 4 or 5 years of that, Peter, quite rightly, became a little disenchanted with this arrangement and said that, if we didn't fire Tom Krenz, why, he would be out of here, as he put it. And that's what happened. Now, and over a period of years, it really was more than $50 million. It was $75 million that Peter Lewis injected into the operation, which is really fantastic. And, of course, we're all so grateful to him. He's been very generous to Princeton, as most of you probably know, as a trustee of Princeton University. So I think basically I've told you everything except a story that people seem to be interested in, getting back to myself again. My mother and father divorced when I was 3 years old. And when I got out of Lawrenceville, I went into the Army and was training to invade Japan. And in the midst of that, halfway through basic training, the atomic bomb was dropped. And instead of invading Japan, I ended up in the Excelsior Hotel in Rome, Italy. And my first responsibility there was to prevent local ladies from going upstairs. It was an enormous responsibility. And I had MPs on all the stairways, all the elevators, and I thought that would be adequate. It wasn't. And I discovered they were going up in the dumbwaiter in the kitchen. And I was immediately promoted for solving this problem. Several months later, we had majors, colonels, and generals staying in this requisitioned hotel. And Lawrence Tibbett, you're all too young to know who he was, but he was an opera singer. And he checked into the hotel, and I took him up to his suite, and I said, will there be anything else, Mr. Tibbett? He said, yes, I want you to locate for me a fellow by the name of Lawson Johnson. Well, I said, Mr. Tibbett, that's me. He said, well, I've just come from Paris. I'm a great friend of your father's, and he's very anxious to meet you. And I said, well, I'm very anxious to meet him too, because growing up, whenever I've done anything wrong, my mother's told me I'm just like him. So there's a lot of admiration there. So he said, well, this is the address, and I suggest you correspond with him, which I did. And the big day came. We were going to meet in the Plaza Hotel in New York, in the Palm Court. And I was on a overstuffed settee, nervously waiting. An older man came and sat next to me. He seemed very nervous, kept looking at his watch. I said, I beg your pardon, sir, but who are you waiting for? He stood up and he said, it's none of your damn business. And it wasn't my father. One of the things that Mr. Tibbett had told me about was that my father was a little sensitive over the fact that he'd had 5 wives. So keep that in mind when you meet your dad. So I recognized my father. He kind of walked the way I do, and I went up to him, and I thought, I can't call him father. That's a little pompous. Pop is a little informal. And I said, hi, Dad. He said, by Jove, you've grown. And I said, yes, and I'm old enough to have a cocktail, and I suggest we go into the Oak Bar. So after he introduced me to a brandy and soda, I've never had one before or since. And remembering what Tibbet had said, I said, "Dad, I understand you've remarried." I didn't telegraph how many times. And he said, "Yes, would you like to meet Paulette?" And I said, "Well, I certainly would." And I did. And she was 2 years older than me. And she did a lot to bring us together, and we all lived happily ever after. I don't know why I end up with that story, but I know you had some questions. I do want to say that if you read the book, you'll know more about how weird my background was growing up. My mother was probably more interested in horses and dogs than children. But she was a great mother, but she was different. And and so anyway, it was a weird background. And people, having read the book, have said to Dee Dee, if Peter's normal, it must be because of you. And I give Dee Dee a lot of credit. I also give Lawrenceville a lot of credit, because I was sent there when I was 12 years old. And I think that was very good, because I was going to at least 2 schools every year. Going off, my mother had 3 husbands, and keeping up with her and her husbands involved going to different schools. I even went with her on a couple of honeymoons. Anyway, if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. Yes, Paul.
You mentioned a factory that should become a museum. Would you like to elaborate on what happened to that factory?
Yes, that is called Mass Mocha, and it has been converted into a museum. And Tom Krenz realized that art, particularly sculpture, but also paintings, are just becoming huge. And so it makes sense to have a factory in order to exhibit these huge works that we have now. In Bilbao, we have one gallery that's as big as a football field, which gives you some idea. And by the way, Frank Gehry gives Tom Krenz a lot of credit for the design of that building, the atrium and that huge gallery.
Favorite artist and/or sculptor?
I think the best exhibit we ever had at the Guggenheim, I think, was a perfect marriage of art and architecture, and that was Calder. But I happen to like Kandinsky, as my grandfather did, and Mondrian, and Rothko. I mean, those are ones that I like. Actually, I grew up, my grandfather lived in the Plaza Hotel, and it was quite a large apartment. And it was kind of interesting. His bedroom was very, very modern. I mean, purple toilet fixtures and so forth. And down the other end of the huge hall, my grandmother's area, which was very Victorian furniture and so forth. It's quite a contrast. But in between, there were these works of art. And I remember vividly looking at a Modigliani nude, which was my first exposure to nudity. I think I went to the Tate many years ago and went from gallery to gallery looking at battle scenes. And I began to think, gee, if you've seen one battle, you've seen them all. And went into another gallery, which was, just as I was saying, modern art. And it just seemed very refreshing and so forth. And that was my first understanding of modern art, which I still don't understand.
Peter, what do you see as the future of the Guggenheim? You need a new Peter Lewis, obviously.
Well, we have a new team now that I'm very happy with, and Jennifer Stockman is our president. If you all remember David Stockman, he was Reagan's chief financial man. Jennifer and my daughter Wendy, and Wendy's head of our, she's vice president, chairman of our governance committee, which is not unimportant. And I've lost my train of thought since I mentioned Yeah, well, and Bill Mack is chairman. And as I said earlier, Peter and Tom were practically ignoring the board. Well, we now have an engaged, reactivated board that really, we're going to have a major campaign, which we've never had, because Tom always just went to the really wealthy people and would dwell on one or two people instead of having a proper campaign, which we're getting revved up to do.
Who initiated the idea of bringing this substantial Russian exhibit?
That's Tom Krenz. I think he gets the credit for that. And we also had a Russian exhibit, 7 or 8 years ago. He's on very good terms with the Russians, and we have a Russian on our board. You asked a question about where we go from here. I think we will probably have another arrangement in the Far East, possibly the Middle East, and possibly South America. We're having discussions now in Hong Kong, Singapore, Guadalajara, Mexico, and in a country in the Middle East. And I don't think we ought to go overboard, but 1 or 2 more would be
You want
okay.
to keep rotating your things around?
We do. I mean, that's part of the deal, is that we circulate. We will organize an exhibit and put it on the road if it's appropriate.
But you've sold a couple of things.
Years ago, we did sell 3 B+ works of art, of which we had many more A and A- and A+ works. And in return for that, I've forgotten, I think the Ponza collection we got, which was how many, 200 and some odd?
Way more than that. Several hundreds of works.
So that is the one time we did it. We were heavily criticized, but you know, it is totally unsportsmanship-like or unethical or something to sell works of art and turn around and spend that money on anything except art. But we're not guilty of having used the money for anything except to acquire other works.
Was Peggy Guggenheim ever reconciled with the family?
Was she ever what?
Reconciled with the family?
Well, that was the reconciliation, because she looked upon her uncles, my grandfather and his brothers, you know, as very stodgy conservatives. And I think the reconciliation came when we accepted, or when she gave us her collection. And I'm very pleased that Carol Vale, her granddaughter, is a curator of ours in New York and has organized some shows. So I think there was a reconciliation before she died. I tell a story, and my son-in-law, Sam McCleary, says I shouldn't tell it, but to give you a flavor of what Peggy was like, I took her to Harry's Bar in Venice with her granddaughter, Carol Vale, many years ago. Carol was going to a boarding school in England that was co-ed. And, you know, halfway through dinner, Peggy said, well, now, Carol, tell your cousin Peter where the boys and girls have their sex on campus. Not do they, but where. But I think that she'd become much more conservative in her later years. Yes, Jake?
Speaking of Peggy Guggenheim, there was a modern biography of hers written
Yes.
4 or 5 years ago, which got mixed reviews, not to say mysterious. And I was wondering if there...
I think there's a woman by the name of Dearborn wrote the most recent book about
Yes.
her. There's been quite a few. In fact, she wrote 1 or 2 herself.
No, I think that was the Dearborn. Is that a respected by the
I think
family?
reasonably respected, yes.
Okay.
And there was a play, you know, in New York
Yes.
within the year about her that wasn't too accurate. But
It was with Mercedes Rule, and it was called
Yeah.
A Woman in the Glass, or what is it?
Woman looking at a glass.
Woman, yeah, I don't remember the title. Was not on Off-Broadway for long.
Yes, Paul?
Good.
I think your motorcycle exhibit brought people into the Guggenheim that never would have set foot there.
Well, you know, we've been criticized for that, and you know, my only complaint about the art world is I think it's a little snooty. I don't see any harm in attracting people that otherwise would never set foot in a museum, and that, you know, we put that on the road. We had it in Las Vegas. We had it in Bilbao. I think we had it somewhere else. It's been very popular. We had it down in Tennessee somewhere.
Yeah, and it's still
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, still going. Yes.
Tell us a little about your process in writing the book. How long did it take you? And
You know, everybody wants to know how long it took. Well, I write longhand. I also had some help from Sam McCleary's father, Bill McCleary, who was sort of a cheerleader for me and helped my syntax, and Rob White, who was in the development office at Lawrenceville School and is now up at Williams College. I was particularly grateful to him for interviewing the two directors. He got a lot of background from them that I probably couldn't have gotten. But, you know, it was almost 20 years ago that I started, and I was pretty busy in those days. I wore a lot of hats. But when I reached the age of 70, you know, they drop you off of boards and things. I had more time. And so it finally all came together in the last couple of years. But it's been fun. My daughter, Mimi, youngest daughter, came into the den the other day. I was behind my desk, and she said, "What are you doing, Dad?" I said, "I know it sounds perfectly ridiculous, but I'm reading my fan mail." And she said, "This book's kind of gone to your head, hasn't it?" And she's kind of right. It's been a wonderful experience for somebody 78 years old to sort of do something looking back. And I'm so proud of my family, and that's what it's all about. You know, what can be more important than marrying the right woman, 55 years, and to have 4 fabulous kids who have married 4 wonderful people and produced 10 wonderful grandchildren, and a great-grandchild on the way. I mean, that's what it's all about. And I think what I'm most proud of is that my kids are not ashamed of the book. They're buying it, giving it to their friends. I was so sure that it was going to be a cure for people's insomnia, but it hasn't turned out that way, and I'm very pleased. Well, you've all been very attentive and wonderful to come here tonight, and it's fun talking to you. Thank you.